Good morning. Happy Friday. And thank you for participating today in our Ed Talk. Ed Talks are short educational webinars presented by the Continuing Education branch of Johnson County Community College. Continuing education courses enhance career development and deepen personal enrichment. Our continuing education program areas include business skills development, careers and trades, computer technology, healthcare, leisure, life skills, English as a second language and GED, along with small business development and youth programs. My name is Tim Frenzel, and I am the Program Director for the Life and Leisure program in CEE. The Life and Leisure program provides a wide variety of courses for not only the relaxing part of your personal life, such as photography, art, dance, home and garden, music, but also those real-life topics that reach you at home, such as money management, home ownership, and career change. Today's Ed Talk will begin with an overview provided by our expert, Stacy, who will then take questions. Questions can be entered anytime via the Q&A panel on your screen. We're very delighted to have Stacy Davidson back with us for today's Ed Talk. Stacy will be discussing food and drink in ancient Egypt. If any of you were here for Stacy's first Ed Talk a while ago, it was received very widely well, and we got a lot of questions and a lot of comments, and I was asked a lot about how do I get more info from Stacy. So I do want to point out she has a couple of classes coming up online with us in Continuing Ed. Tuesday nights, September 1st through October 20th is Egyptian hieroglyphs, and Wednesday nights, September 2nd through the 23rd, animals in ancient Egypt. Stacy teaches classes consistently with us that are very highly received, and definitely check them out if you want some more information. At this point, I will turn it over to Stacy. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. I hope everyone is doing as well as can be expected with getting ready for school and navigating our new lifestyle, I guess you could say. So I wanted to choose a topic that I thought would be interesting to many of you, and one that I've been asked about many, many times. I think that there is a tendency to focus on things like pyramids and gold and tombs and temples, which is great, but that doesn't really tell us very much about the way that the ancient Egyptians would have lived day to day. So the kinds of things that we can really relate to in our lives, we can look at with the ancient Egyptians as well. For example, depending on where you are watching from, so this morning, maybe you just had breakfast. We have various different food ways of what we like to eat for breakfast, but you know, in the United States, we kind of have what you would consider to be breakfast foods. If you were someone living in ancient Egypt, your choice of breakfast might be something that we would consider a little bit unusual. And your ability to collect different kinds of food and eat that on a regular basis also would depend on your social status. And that's another similarity that we kind of have today. So if you started out this morning in ancient Egypt, just your everyday Egyptian, perhaps your breakfast was bread. Okay, we're good with that. Beer and onions. Bread, beer, and onions for breakfast. Perhaps after that, depending on your job, you might be working at manual labor all day. If so, your next main meal might be later in the afternoon or the early evening. If you were someone who had what we would call an inside job, so someone who was not necessarily working with plowing the fields or doing kind of blacksmithing or kind of hard labor, you might have several meals a day, and your food would be of a greater variety as well. So we're going to look at some of the different kinds of food that there was in ancient Egypt. And I just also want to say that we don't really have any cookbooks. Unlike Mesopotamia, where we actually have tablets that tell us different ingredients and kind of how they're put together, for ancient Egypt, we seem to be missing this kind of vital piece of information. So basically, we're just going to look at the types of food that they had, how you might see those in artworks or in models and tombs, and how they used the different foods and drinks in other ways, like to take with them to the afterlife. So we'll start with bread. The staple ingredients for bread, basically you have many different kinds of wheat that you could have in bread. There have been breads found in tombs. So on this slide, you have different examples of actual bread that ancient Egyptians made with their hands and put into tombs that still survives. That I find is very fascinating, and it actually kind of unites you with someone in the past. I think that a lot of us during our kind of stay-at-home time recently have been kind of trying our hand at different kinds of baking and cooking maybe. So think about your pandemic baking that you've been doing for bread, and think about having to do that every day, because that is something that the Egyptians ate every single day. It was a major part of every meal that they had was bread. So you would have to constantly make sure that you had a supply for yourself and your family. For most periods of time in ancient Egypt, there was not coin money. So how people were paid was often in rations of food, and the most common rations were bread and beer. On this slide, we have an example of a model. So in many tombs, there were models of activities that were present in everyday life. When someone was going to the afterlife, if they were able to be wealthy enough, we can say, to buy or obtain these kinds of goods to take with them, they believed that it was kind of like the biggest trip. It was the last and final trip, and you needed to take everything with you in order to have access to it. So to have bread, you might have pictures of bread, you might have words that say bread in the tomb, but you might also have tomb models like this one, showing people making bread and showing the different stages so that this could work for you in the next world. Also with bread, about a year ago, you might have seen a popular article going around that bread was made from yeast that was scraped off of museum pots. Someone made some sourdough bread out of it, which apparently has a sort of different taste than modern sourdough would have. And that's kind of an interesting kind of experimental Egyptology. I like when we can reproduce experiments to try to really understand something about the ancient world and make it more relatable. Beer is the second of the two major items that people would typically have. And when we're saying beer, you should not think of the beer that we have today. So the beer that we have readily available usually has a kind of a high degree of hops in it. We don't believe that the Egyptians were using hops. So their kind of beer was definitely different. For example, we're used to having kind of very clear, strained beer. The Egyptian beer was kind of cloudy and it had suspended particles in it. So part of the beer making process was kind of left in the beer. And this is something that was consumed by everyone in ancient Egypt. Children, adults, older people, everybody was drinking beer. The alcohol content was less than our alcohol content today. And this beer also contained complex carbs, sugars, fatty acids, amino acids, minerals, and vitamins. So it had more of a nutritional value than your recreational beverage for today. We know that bread and beer are two of the main types of food and drink in ancient Egypt. And we know that they were very, very important. But what we don't actually have is a lot of archaeological evidence of bakeries and breweries. From things like tomb models, we can see that this model is showing that your bakery and your brewery are one and the same. So two parts of the same complex. And that is because both of these products used the same starting materials. And you didn't want to have a lot of waste. So you would want to find a way for your discarded material from one production path to be used easily by the other people who need it. So usually breweries and the bakeries are shown in artwork and models as being in the same complex. So here is a drawing of a scene from a tomb, Theban tomb 60, which shows the bakery and the brewery process sort of in related registers in the tomb. And since bread and beer were part of the salary, we have a few records that say an approximation of what someone might get for a salary. So for example, from the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, we have a record of an expedition to the Wadi Hammamat in which the leader of the expedition was receiving, just wait for it, 200 loaves of bread and 5 jars of beer daily. The workers that he was leading received 10 loaves of beer. 10 loaves of bread and a third of a jar of beer per day. So wage equality is not, it's not a modern concept. We also have some modern beers. People have been trying to recreate or at least simulate what ancient beer might have been like. So we have a few different examples from modern day breweries, but they are not using the ancient methods. They are simply adding some kind of flavory elements like spices and fruit to give you that sense of being in ancient Egypt. If you're not a huge fan of beer, the Egyptians did also have wine. It seems that the wine was reserved more for the upper classes or the people higher in society rather than the everyday Egyptian. We even have some examples of wine jars that have markings on them saying that the wine was good, or very, very good. So you had ranking of wine in the ancient world as well as today. Originally, the process for wine probably came from the Eastern Mediterranean area. We're not entirely sure which varieties of grapes exactly they were using and what the final output of wine would be, but it seems like from different texts that it was most likely a kind of red wine that would actually be mixed with some of the juice from the first pressing. So it might be kind of a reddish. Interestingly enough, there is a god of the wine press called Shesmu. And Shesmu is a very, very interesting character. He has good and bad qualities, but in one of the texts, he is described as a slaughterer and someone who squeezes heads in the wine press. So that's quite vivid. And since we're in 2020, if you are someone who loves Egyptian wine and Egyptian wine motifs and grapes, someone has actually made a face mask with the Tomb of Senefer ceiling motif on it. So aside from the food and drink, the bread and beer that we just saw, we also have many kinds of fruits and vegetables that are present in both text and artwork from ancient Egypt. So these are a few of the kinds of fruits and veggies that the Egyptians had. You can look at this list. This looks like a very healthy kind of Mediterranean diet type of list. So things like onions and garlic, lettuce, radishes, cucumbers, dates, figs, grapes, and olives. In addition, the lettuce in particular seems to be one of the few vegetables that were native to Egypt. So most of these other vegetables and fruits on the slide were actually imported at a different point in time and then became grown in the Nile Valley. Many of these come originally from the Eastern Mediterranean, so the area that's now Israel, Syria, Jordan, that area. And that's just because people in the ancient world traded and traveled a lot. So one concept I like to tell people is that just because it's something in the ancient world doesn't mean that they were stuck in one place all the time. So figs, I just wanted to show you that we still have some actual figs from ancient Egypt. So part of the tomb goods, or the items that the deceased person wanted to go with them to the afterlife, still survive and can be found in museums today. And frequently, figs are found with images of monkeys. There is an idea in some of the artwork that they trained monkeys to pick figs, like workers. But we also have just images of them eating, as you can see here on this slide. If you love pomegranates like I do, the Egyptians also had pomegranates. They also would make different kinds of jars that maybe held pomegranate juice or another liquid in it in the shape of these pomegranates. As far as legumes and grains, also this would seem very much like a Mediterranean diet. So if you like hummus or hummus, that is something that's typically made with chickpeas. The Egyptians did have chickpeas. We're not sure exactly if they had a hummus, but it's possible that they did. And many of these also come originally from the Eastern Mediterranean, and a few of them come farther from places like India. Tomb scenes also will show the afterlife. So the afterlife will be a world similar to this one, in which work still had to be done, crops still had to be planted and harvested. So you can see some of the ways that the Egyptians may have harvested and planted and plowed by looking at some of these tomb scenes. If you love honey or beekeeping, the Egyptians also kept bees. There is a native Egyptian bee called the Apis mellifera, or the Western honeybee. And this is kind of smaller and more aggressive than your typical honeybee that you are probably familiar with. So this is one of the first domesticated insects. So actually making these hives, which are typically ceramic, they're kind of long, and they would stuff the ends of them to kind of keep the bees in there, and harvest the honey for both food and medicine. You can see in some of the images that they hold a smoke pot. So on the left side here, you can kind of see this guy here holding up a pot that has fire. So there's smoke in it, which is similar to how we would be able to harvest honey today by using smoke. So far we've had bread, beer, vegetables, fruit, honey. How about meat? So meat is something that also was dependent on your status in society. So the most expensive or the most prestigious kind of meat was cattle. So beef from oxen or cows. We often see cuts of oxen's legs as being offerings that people want for the afterlife. So they, even if they maybe didn't necessarily have that in every day in their real world, they would want to have that most precious, tastiest cut of meat for the afterlife. Typical kinds of animals like sheep and fish was very commonly eaten, but also they would eat different kinds of birds, mice, and unfortunately, the really adorable hedgehogs were also used as food. Here's another tomb scene that shows a butchery process, and that is actually a very common motif to see in different kinds of tomb reliefs. So again, having this part of the everyday life be extended into the afterlife. We also have bird hunting scenes, and we can see this very elaborate setup. We have a net on this side that is capturing all of these different kinds of birds. So there are frequently fowling scenes or bird hunting scenes in tombs, and it seems like they hunted the birds for food, but also they kept domesticated birds and ate them. They used eggs as well. But the chicken, we think, actually didn't come in until fairly late in ancient Egypt. So there was a story about bringing back from Southwest Asia this kind of miraculous bird that laid an egg every day. Fish, as I mentioned, was quite common. The Nile was there. It's something that was accessible to many people. The kinds of fish, many kinds, and you can see a few are shown on this slide, and they're also shown kind of out of proportion. Probably the fish were not quite that large, but this is for the afterlife. So you wanted to have the biggest and the best for your afterlife. If you look kind of towards the right here, you can see that this one has whiskers. So there's a kind of Nile catfish that has the whiskers, is very distinctive looking. And if you've been waiting very patiently and you're wondering, where's all my favorite food? Well, they did not have tomatoes, peppers, ears of corn, pumpkins, potatoes, or chocolate, because these are all coming from the Americas, and there was no trade that went that far in ancient Egypt. Food is also used as medicine, not just as food. And we've heard that in our modern world as well, right? What you eat is for your health. Your food is your medicine. And in that way, we do actually have some kind of recipes or some prescriptions, you could say, for how to use the food. So you could use it externally or internally, depending on what your situation is. And we have a few different papyri. One's called the Edwin Smith papyrus, and the other is the Ebers papyrus. These are just named from people who procured them, not the original names of the papyri. And for example, if you have a cut on your face and there's swelling, they suggest that you put fresh meat on it every day and treat it with grease, honey, and a pad until the person has healed. If you have a cough, you would mix honey and ox fat and water of sarem, which we're not exactly sure what that is, and then you would consume that. Or if you have a stomach ache, you might mix these different ingredients, including oil and honey and carob and hematite, of all things, and then you would consume that for a period of 4 different days to kind of help your stomach ache. And food for the afterlife. So some of what you can see in museums are food boxes. So this food box on the left side that looks kind of like a bean shape actually will contain meat. So when you see this kind of whitish beanie shape, you have some kind of mummified meat in there. You have a lot of fruits and breads that have survived in museums that you can see today. And on the right side here, there is a mummified goose. So you can still kind of see that goose shape to that wrapping there. And I just wanted to show you a couple other images of people either preparing or eating these geese. And the last thing we'll cover today is a little bit about the offering formula. So I mentioned how important it was to have your food and your drink and also clothing and other items to go with you to the afterlife, so you wouldn't be able to use them there. And we have something that's very special called the offering formula. And it starts off with a series of 4 hieroglyphs, an offering the king gives. Then we have a list and titles of major gods. And then we have what you can see on the right here, which is another set of 4 hieroglyphs, which can be translated invocation offerings or voice offerings. Immediately after that set, you know that you're going to see a list of goods. So you are going to see, basically, people will ask for meat first, and then maybe some linen, different kinds of precious goods to be able to take with them. So if you're familiar with the Nelson Atkins Museum, this is a close-up of what was on the first slide here. So we have the stela of Seanchi and Ankef Anhu. And this is from the site of Abydos in the Middle Kingdom time period. And we have here a husband and wife, and in front of them, you can see that there's this huge table, and this table is packed with food. So on the right side here, you can see here's the table being represented. Here is one of those beef legs, basically. You have other cuts of beef. You have different breads. You have a whole head of an ox here. You have some greenery. You have some onions. You can even see the bottom here. It looks kind of like a spring onion bundle up here, and a bird. So Seanchi and his wife, Ankef Anku, would want to have these kinds of items to sustain them in the next world. And if we take a quick look at this slide, we can see those different elements that we saw of the offering formula kind of superimposed onto the actual stela. So you can pick out, this is the opening. Then we have Osiris here, or Wesir. So he's the king who is in charge of the afterlife. So we have his names and titles. We also have Anubis, who's the jackal-headed god, being invoked here. Then on the third line, we have that signifier of the offering list. And then after that, we have a hieroglyph here, which is standing for the number 1,000. So you would want 1,000 oxen, or 1,000 birds, or 1,000 items of clothing to be able to take with you to the next world. So hopefully you learned something about food and drink in ancient Egypt, and we will also open up for questions. So if you did not have a chance to type a question into the Q&A panel, please take a few moments to do that. That's found on your control panel. It says Q&A, so you just click it, and then you can type your answer and then hit enter. And thank you very much for attending my Ed Talk this morning. If you have other questions that come to you after this webinar has ended, you can always email me or check me out on my blog or social media. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stacy. We will open up with the first question here. Did the Egyptians have mead?
Mead. So not that we know exactly. So there is some very good research that's being done by Dr. Warden at Roanoke College about this whole beer making process. So she's trying to take as close as she can to ancient starting materials. So the kinds of wheat are different than what we typically have access to with like home brewing and things. So she has been conducting some experiments about trying to replicate the process, figuring out what kinds of a setup that you would need. So in terms of space or production, like workshops and things like that. So hopefully she will have some of that material available for us to review soon.
What grains were used for bread?
So primarily the grains they're using, I'd say that emmer wheat is probably the primary one. So sometimes they would mix that with some figs and some other things. They did have barley, but it doesn't seem like a lot of the bread really contains barley that has been analyzed thus far.
Is there any indication of obesity or heart disease in ancient Egypt related to their diet?
So great question. There is absolutely evidence of people having things like arterial sclerosis, people who were overweight, people who had cancer. So it seems like people in the ancient world also suffered from many of the same kinds of maladies that we have today, even though our diets and our activity levels are vastly different.
This one is related to that one. So were there any indications of widespread death due to vitamin and mineral deficiencies in their diet?
Okay, so in the ancient world, let's just start with this. Life expectancy was very much lower than we would have today. So even though some people did live a very long time, and we think that there's evidence for some people maybe living into their 60s or even maybe into their 80s in ancient Egypt, the average life expectancy would maybe be, if you were lucky, maybe in your 30s. This was a little bit lower for women because of the dangers of childbirth. It was quite dangerous, as it still can be today. So perhaps late 20s, early 30s. So life expectancy, just right off the bat, was very much lower than today. There is evidence that there were different kinds of famines, different kinds of deficiencies that you can see in the skeletal remains. Yeah.
Right. Was beer a way to sanitize water?
Good question. So this is something that has been taught to us for quite a long time. So if you think about people using the Nile for everything, for transportation, for washing clothes, for drinking water, there are, dead animals floating in it, things like that. Being something that's filled with parasites and pathogens and other kinds of things. So that's the traditional viewpoint, is that having this kind of fermentation process would assist with that in some way. And that's probably partially true, but I think that currently there is a shift of thinking away from that being such a simplistic answer.
You might have already gotten to this one, but how do we know the exact composition of Egyptian beer?
Yeah. So yes, there is not any like step-by-step Egyptian homebrew kind of method that we have in a text. So how we're figuring this out is largely by using analytical chemistry methods to sample the insides of vessels, to look at the process as we have it in artwork on tombs to see kind of what that might actually be like. So as I mentioned, Dr. Warden is working on this right now. So I think she is the expert on the Egyptian beer at this point. But she's finding out that you can't necessarily do the same exact thing every time and receive the same results. So I think every one of us who has any experience in chemistry or baking or anything that takes kind of material science knowledge knows that even if you try to replicate your experiment exactly, some kind of a factor will often influence it, some sort of variable. So it's still very much in the research process right now.
Do you know anything about the types of jars used for beer versus milk and wine?
Yes, so these would have different shapes. So the shape also would correspond to purpose and kind of what is inside of the vessel. So for example, speaking about wine, it's not like a wine bottle today. The Egyptians really didn't age the wines. Basically, it would expire. And the same with the beer. The beer is not going to last indefinitely. There's like a window in which it's drinkable, and then before or after that, it's not really something you can consume.
Let me see. I don't know if I'll pronounce this right, but would this diet and food still be a common one in the Ptolemaic Egypt?
Okay, good. Yeah, good job. Yeah, Ptolemaic Egypt. So this is referencing that time period kind of at the end of what we consider to be sort of ancient Egyptian history between about 332 and 30 BCE. So I think that I don't necessarily have enough information to be able to say exactly an answer to that question. But we do know that there are many different kinds of imports and different kinds of foods that start to be cultivated and used in Egypt at that time because of this mix of different cultures. So the Ptolemies were coming from Greece, essentially. So this is a Greek dynasty ruling the area of Egypt. So one thing I can say for that, prior to the Ptolemies, it seems like olives primarily in Egypt were for eating, whereas when the Ptolemies come, then we start to see evidence of olive oil being processed and consumed in ancient Egypt. So there absolutely is some sort of an influence.
All right. What was fed to babies as first foods?
Ooh, that is a really excellent question. I'm not sure that I have an answer for that, but I can say that we do have some evidence of jars that were possibly used for milk for babies, which is really kind of interesting. So kind of like having like an ancient sippy cup type of thing. Probably some sort of milk was in there, but as far as first foods, I'm not exactly sure the exact ones that they would use. And I'm not sure that we necessarily would be able to know that because unfortunately, things to do with women's kind of daily life and also absolutely children seem to be somewhat invisible in the archaeological record, which is a lot of what we have to go on typically, unless there is a text that specifically mentions something about children.
Did children have any specific treats that they liked, or did they make any sweets in general?
So they had honey cakes. So honey was the main sweetener, the main sweetening agent that they had. And some of those other fruits like the figs and the dates were also, if you've had those, they're quite sweet as well. So they would mix those into kind of like pastries or cakes.
How did their diet affect the condition of their teeth?
Yes. So ancient Egyptian dentistry is actually kind of a really interesting thing. So imagine if you were not able to have your kind of normal preventative medicine for getting cleanings and things, a cavity could kill you. A root canal could turn into an abscess, which could kill you. So just to kind of keep in mind the fact that lives were really so much harder for trying to survive what we would consider to be simple procedures that could actually end up being fatal. We do know that teeth were typically quite ground down, and some of that might be because of the kinds of sand that just invades everything. If you've been to a desert anywhere, you know it doesn't matter if you try to keep sand out of your water bottle or sand out of your food, sand will get in there. And what is sand? Sand is basically glass. It has quartz in it. So you're using that you're chewing and kind of wearing down your teeth as you go on in life. And tooth loss was very common. We do also, however, have some evidence of dentistry, and some people would kind of get false teeth put into their mouths, like a crown, like a fake tooth to kind of help you as you go on.
You said that life expectancy was around the 30s. What was the life expectancy for pharaohs?
Yeah. So the pharaoh, of course, or the king, would have access to many more resources than the average Egyptian would have. And there is a kind of tradition of Egyptian physicians being the best in the ancient world. So the king would have access to what was available. And medicine didn't necessarily equally translate to medicine today. Some of it did include consuming things or using things topically, as we saw on those few examples on the slide. But also magic had a lot to do with it, or this word that we use that we call magic. So things that would be kind of a mixture of prayer and ritual, as well as physical objects to kind of help you out. As far as king's reigns go, if we have texts that mention the king, it does mention, in year such and such of this person's reign. So we can kind of judge how long that would be. And honestly, it does vary as well. So we have some texts that mention kings living possibly into their 90s, but we also have kings that maybe lived a year or two after assuming the throne, and then another king is in place. So it does vary.
When paying the leader 200 loaves of bread and beer, would that be for their household consumption or just for their own needs?
Yeah, so it is for, technically that's his salary. So that's what he receives for his work. That does not mean he's eating 200 loaves a day, or probably not drinking 5 jars of beer per day. But he could then take that to trade for other items that he needed or wanted. So without this kind of monetary economy, the Egyptians did have a robust economy, but it was just based on basically like a barter or a value system where this bread is worth this much of another product. So you could trade for that. But hopefully he was sharing with his household as well.
So did individuals and families grow their own food, or were there community gardens, farms, and markets?
Yeah. So I did want to mention that, and I totally forgot. So that's a great question. Yes, there would often be kind of a home garden as well. So you might have things that you would take to a market, but you probably were also just producing for your own household. So if gardening instead of baking is something that you took up this summer, you can kind of identify with the ancient Egyptians.
Are there any examples of ancient Egyptian fast food sold by strangers?
Good question again. I don't have the answer to that, but I assume that there was. We know that we have that kind of event in places like Greece and Rome. It just kind of comes down to a couple factors for some of these very excellent questions that you have about daily life in Egypt. One factor is that we do not have a lot of settlements or town sites that have been excavated. The ones that we do are sort of unique and shouldn't necessarily be made to think that everything in the entire area was the same as that specific town. So because people tend to live on a place that is useful to them over periods of time, a lot of these ancient town sites are under modern town sites, and we obviously are not going to destroy people's houses and dig down under them just to find out about some of these answers. So we don't have a lot of this really excellent kind of settlement information for ancient Egypt, unfortunately. And what we do have that we have been using to kind of supplement that is text. And that also, however, depends on if the text survives, what kinds of texts survive. Typically that has to do with where they're found. So if they're found in a tomb or an archive, those kinds of materials will be different from, let's say, a shopping list to take to the market, or something that might be a personal correspondence between people. So we do have a lack of some of that evidence at this point.
Did Egyptians use any kind of utensils to eat?
Pretty much you're going to be using your hands for the most part. So if you're someone who likes not having to worry about being prim and proper and just digging right into that food when you're hungry, you would appreciate that way of eating.
Right. Back to a couple beer questions. How did beer first develop? Did it come from the bread production?
Yeah, so we know that there was beer also in Mesopotamia. And who made that first initial step to decide that this partially fermented product was actually worth consuming is a great thing to think about, and I'm not sure that we exactly know. And that is kind of the same for a lot of our kind of firsts, our world firsts, is who is the first person to decide that this was edible? Was this a trial and error situation? Did they just leave part of this bread making discarded material for a couple days and then decide, well, let's see what happens. Let's just run an experiment and drink this and see if I live. I don't know.
And about how big was the average jar of beer that they made?
So we have evidence for different sizes. So I think if you want to think jar, this is not going to be like a single serve type of a beer bottle. So this would be something that would be more sizable. So maybe something more like a gallon of milk size, maybe smaller, depending.
How did they preserve their food?
Well, they ate it really fast. They did have salt, so they could salt meat to kind of preserve that for a little bit. But there's no refrigeration or anything like that, so food would spoil fairly quickly. And also, you had to consider different kinds of animals would eat it as well. So you needed to try to keep those animals out of your food supply if you could.
Was the same food eaten by all provinces throughout ancient Egypt?
Yeah, so regional variations definitely occurred. So if you're familiar a little bit with the geography, in northern Egypt, you have what is called the Delta area, and that's where the Nile kind of branches off into its different tributaries. And the climate and the topography and the moisture level is very, very different from southern Egypt, which is more of a desert and more dry today. Again, in the ancient world, it was a similar situation, but we did also have climate change events happening between now and then. So the climate has increasingly become more arid as time went on towards today. So originally, maybe 5-ish thousand years ago, the climate wasn't so arid. You might get rain occasionally in Egypt, which is very rare today.
Are there any examples of food prep hygiene, like washing of hands?
So, not that I can think of exactly. But the way that ancient societies looked at disease or being dirty was completely different from how we look at it today, because we have information, we have science, we have microscopes, and people have worked on germ theory for a few hundred years. So we understand something about what we can't see also can affect and harm us, and what simple steps that we can take to prevent that. In the ancient world, however, being stricken with a disease or an illness or being born with one of these basically the way that they thought about it is that something was attacking you, and that something could be an evil spirit of some sort, however you want to think about that, or you have offended a god somewhere. So your best effort to rectify that, if you could find out which god it is that you think you offended, is to make offerings or prayers to that deity, to do different kinds of rituals to try to appease that deity and get them to help take this away from you. So there was definitely kind of a blame the victim mentality on getting sick. Something you did was not proper. As far as washing, in some temple context in ancient Egypt, we do have evidence of hand washing for, not necessarily for physical purity, but for ritual purity, which is a very kind of complicated topic. But we do have some implements that were used for purifying by water different kinds of gods or people who are working with different temple professions.
Is there any indication of death due to malnutrition or starvation due to poverty, or, for lack of a better wording, living in a food desert? Were the food poor taken care of or provided by the state?
Yeah, so unfortunately, yes, people did starve and die. We do have some texts and some artworks that are describing events like that happen, that are pretty tragic, kind of at the end of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, which is the time in which the pyramids were built, into the next major time period, the first intermediate period. We have basically the collapse of what we would consider the collapse of the Old Kingdom line of kings due to a number of factors, including climate change, including lack of an heir for the king. Since he lived so long, he outlived his sons. So there was a struggle about who would be next. And basically the centralized government loses their ability to kind of be in power and be in control. So what happens is that the provinces or the nomes become more important. So you kind of have maybe a major city in your province, and the mayor, or what we would call the mayor of that city, would be the one in charge for his area. And we do have texts of some of these mayors saying things like, "I didn't let my people starve. People were dying all around us, and people were eating their own children. It was so bad, but I didn't let this happen in my town because I took care of my people." So it's absolutely, yes, absolutely, people did suffer and die for lack of access to simple needs of human nature throughout ancient Egypt. So there does not seem to be necessarily any kind of a top-down safety net situation. You would hope that you would try to take care of your family and neighbors, but things were pretty harsh for everybody at that time.
Is there an ancient dish you would love to try, and are there any you would want to avoid?
That's a nice question. Thank you. I'll start with the avoiding. I'm a vegetarian, so unfortunately I will not be eating any of the meat products, and definitely not any of the really super cute hedgehogs. I will avoid all of that. But the rest of it, I really enjoy the vegetables and the fruit that they had. I would absolutely like to try the way that they baked bread. I would want to find out how that's different from how we make bread today. And I would certainly try the beer, even though it might be a little bit chewy. I would try it.
What is the AE word for cheese?
Oh my goodness. Okay, this is probably, I wonder, is this like a plant question? This is awesome. We have no idea what the word for cheese was. We know that they had milk. At least in some parts of their life, they were drinking some milk. They probably noticed that milk did certain things under certain conditions. So they may have had things like butter, and they may have had cheese, but we don't know that we have really solidly figured out what that identifying word is. And we do have some other texts coming from the Greeks who are talking about, yeah, the Egyptians have all of this really good stuff, but they don't have cheese. So like, what's with the Egyptians, kind of? So that's a good question. We're still doing some research on the cheese there.
Is there any evidence that they drank milk like we do?
They probably did not drink it like we do, but they did have milk. We know that there are milk jugs or milk jars. Children probably were consuming some of this milk, but I don't think they would have consumed it as adults in the way that we do today.
Okay, and I think we'll do one last question.
All right.
Here. Did the Hebrews living in Egypt during the time around the Exodus, would they rely on the same foods that you've talked about today?
Okay, so we have no evidence from the Egyptian perspective of the Exodus, so I can't speak to that today. But we do have evidence of people from what is now southern Israel who moved into the delta of Egypt in the north over a period of several hundred years. And they became quite prominent in what we call the Second Intermediate Period. And this is a time in which they actually, people who may have been Egyptian, but culturally their families came from southern Israel region, they actually rule Egypt as the Hyksos dynasty. And we know that they retained close ties with what's now southern Israel. There is a mixture, though, at, for example, the site of Tel El Daba or Avaris or Hutwaret, which was the ancient term. There is a mixture of kind of South Israel and also Egyptian going on there. So probably their foodways, as well as other cultural markers, as well as like their religion and different kinds of daily life themes would be different from Egyptians further south than the Delta. But that is also a difficult thing to try to figure out because the Hyksos did not leave us a lot of texts. And the texts that we do have from them are very, very short. They're written in the Egyptian language and basically are just mentioning the name of their king and like 2 pieces of information. So we don't have any lengthy texts that we have identified from them. So it's very difficult to say much about their daily life apart from an excavation context.
Okay, thank you very much, Stacy. The chat is full of people saying how much they enjoy, and thank you for that.
Great. Yeah, you're welcome.
I would like to thank everyone else for attending today as well, and to please join us on Tuesday, August 25th at 10 a.m. for our newest Ed Talk, A Hay Hauler's Guide to Coping with Life by Gordon Billingsley. Thank you all and have a good day.